Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We've been going through the book by Angie McCartney entitled My Long and Winding Road, and it's been interesting to see Angie interact with Paul and to go into his circle, as well as being the wife to Jim McCartney. So let's see what she's up to today. Angie said that she met Cynthia Lennon briefly at various Beatles-related events over the years. She said they didn't get really connected until later on. After Cynthia and John broke up, she married Roberto Bassanini and lived in Wimbledon. Angie visited her and her husband Roberto, and he would call down to her asking for various refreshments. Angie said that they hooked up again when she lived in Ruthin, North Wales. Angie was invited to Cynthia's wedding to John Twist in 1967. When Cynthia was single once more, she moved back to live on Wirral, and she and Julian would visit her and Jim at their home in Rembrandt. Cynthia was the one to suggest to Jim that Ruth and Angie needed to get away for a little holiday and a break from his constant round-the-clock arthritis care. She offered to come by Rembrandt frequently to keep Jim company or to run any errands he might need, and to back up Jim's sister Millie, who was to stay with him. So Angie and Ruth went on a 14-day Mediterranean cruise for some rest and relaxation. It was at this time that John started to renew his interest in Julian. He sent him a motorcycle for a present, along with an invitation to visit him and Yoko in America. Cynthia wasn't totally on board with the idea, but she didn't want to be the one to come between Julian and his dad. Angie said that there was no doubt of Julian's love for his father, and it was sad that they never had enough time together. Angie said that they had a happy time at Julian's 21st birthday party at Stringfellows Club in London. She met a few celebrities, including Rob Lowe, and then Julian rode into the party on a white horse, so that must have been something. In grown years, Ruth was a choreography contestant and Julian a judge at a Claim to Fame concert held at the Embassy Club in London in 1981. The press linked them as a romantic item, but Angie said that they weren't. They were just good friends. Ruth was 3 years older than Julian and not his type. They all went their separate ways, and they met up again in Los Angeles in 1984 when Julian was putting out his first album, Velotte. They just took up where they left off, and that's a true sign of friendship, Angie said. Angie said that Cynthia and her would chat regularly on the phone, and Cynthia talked to Julian on the phone every day. They were as close as her and Ruth are. Then Julian sent Angie a copy of his beautiful coffee book table, Beatles Memorabilia, and it made Angie happy. It documented all his father's belongings that he managed to gradually retrieve. He got into photography, and he's being valued as he should be. When Angie was in her early years of marriage to Jim, she opened Paul's fan mail, and she had to sort mail into geographical locations. Australia mail went to the floor down under, Asian and Pacific mail on the window's ledge. And there was one fan mail from a young lady whose postal addresses kept getting closer and closer. Angie got a call from the Liverpool police one night in Liverpool. She had been discovered as a stowaway on a freighter which had just arrived. She said she was invited to the home of Paul McCartney. Paul was home at the time and spoke to her on the phone. She ended up arriving at Rembrandt, and Angie said they fed her, made tea, and called her a taxi, and booked her a room at a small Mount Pleasant hotel. It did take a little time to get her to leave. Years later, Linda told her that the girl was a constant visitor to their home in Cavendish Avenue and even took the kids to the park. Linda met her in a grocery store and didn't think she was a threat. She said we were just all a little more innocent then. Then Angie told her about the girl turning up in Liverpool. She became a little wary. Now we come to Freda Kelly. Angie said she was originally Brian Epstein's assistant at the North End Music Store. When the Beatles became famous, she became their fan club secretary after the original lady passed it on due to her other commitments. Freda was very loyal and devoted and trustworthy, and until 2011, she never considered doing an interview about her time with them. Angie would take shoeboxes full of mail that Paul got at Rembrandt and take it to Freda. Their friendship went back to the early 60s, just after Angie married Jim. Angie, I didn't know this, she started the Wings fan club for Paul after his split from the Beatles, and gradually her and Freda lost touch. In 2012, they got back in touch. Freda had become a grandmother, and she finally decided to put some stories down for the record, and she did a documentary to be called Good Old Freda. Angie stated in January 1965, 2 months after she married Jim, Jim asked Alistair Taylor, Brian Epstein's general manager, to book them a trip for a honeymoon. Alistair arranged for them to go to Nassau, Bahamas, and the Beatles were filming Help there. They were taking Ruth with them, and at first they couldn't find her on the passenger list. Then they found out that Angie was listed as Angie McCartney, and Ruth was listed as Ruth Williams. So Jim got mad about it and vowed to legally adopt Ruth when they returned home, so that she would be a McCartney. Then they were taken care of at the Balmoral Club, and Ruth celebrated her 5th birthday. And when they were at the Balmoral Club, they saw Ted Kennedy arriving. He had a neck brace. He had been involved in a plane crash a few months earlier. Angie said she wasn't aware of who he was, being a greenhorn from England. Brian took good care of Angie and Jim during their stay there, even though he had a lot of duties regarding the movie production. And Angie remembered one night when her and Jim were dining under the stars and palm trees, the local wandering musicians came to their table and played Yellow Bird, and then parentheses, Up High in the Banana Tree, and Jim gave them an ample tip. After that, the musicians went straight to them when they saw them. Brian would send a car for them each morning to go to the location where the boys were filming. Angie thought it was fascinating, and she remembered one scene when they all got on bicycles riding in a circle. The sound of Paul's lines, "A man's got to do what a man's got to do," wasn't good enough for the director, Richard Lester, and she was flabbergasted that so many takes had to be done in the blazing hot sun till Lester was satisfied. She said that filmmaking wasn't easy, and there was a lot of hurry up and wait. Angie said it seemed like there wasn't a real rapport between the boys and Eleanor Braun, who was the female lead in the movie. They were nice to her, but she was more middle class and well educated than they were. Angie said she never saw Eleanor in the evenings either, or in the restaurant or in the bar, so she guessed that she must have gone to her room early to prepare for the next day. Angie said the boys were pretty laced on something most afternoons, and she said it was well documented that they were smoking a lot of pot, even while working. The director would have to do take after take while the lads were giggling their silly heads off. Lester was very patient with them, though, and she thought there was probably a lot of footage that was wasted. Angie said that the director had his wife and son with him, and the boy was hyper, running around the set. And she remembered that Jim, the strict disciplinarian, was horrified at how little control the parents had over his behavior. Angie said they had great evenings at the bar with fun people like Roy Kinnear and Victor Spinetti. The British actor Leo McKern would regale us with stories of his adventures in state and films. He was the bad guy in the movie, so when he came to the bar, the boys would hiss and boo. Angie said it was a honeymoon to remember. Now, Angie's going to speak a little about George Harrison. He was an occasional visitor to Rembrandt, and he was fond of his Uncle Jim, as he called him. His first greeting would be to Angie would be, "Hello, Ange, put the kettle on." Angie said that it seems like that in every phase of her life, tea has always been center stage. George loved Jim's custard, and whenever he popped in, that was another order of the day. He always wanted to know the secret of how Jim can make custard without it forming a skin on the top. Jim would never tell him for some reason. And then Jim did tell Angie, and whenever she makes a custard or trifle, she always does it the Jimmy Mac way. One day, Ruth was at her piano lessons, which she hated, and Angie picked her up and took her home. Ruth was happy to see George in the lounge. She put down her music case, and he asked her how she was getting on. He had a feeling she didn't like her lessons, so he sat her down at the piano and took the seat on the bench beside her and taught her a raga and explained Indian music to her. Angie said that it got Ruth's attention. Angie also remembered they had a nice afternoon at Ken Fon's in Esher, where George and Patty lived, on one of their trips to London. Angie said that Patty was sweet and made them feel welcome. After that, their paths went separate ways, and she said she didn't see much of George and Patty until his mom, Louise Harrison's funeral in July 1970. Now we come to Hunter Davies. Angie said in the early years of her marriage to Jim, Hunter spent hours around the kitchen table. Jim told him stories about the family, and Jim told him how happy he was when Paul told him he could give up his job and bought him a house called Rembrandt on the Wirral Peninsula. It was put in Davies' book entitled The Beatles. He wrote about Jim and Angie and the adoption of Ruth. Telling the story, Jim realized how happy they all were. She said Hunter painted a very fair and accurate snapshot of Jim at that time of his life. He said that Jim was comfortable in his new home with his new wife, who would drive him everywhere. and Jim had weekly visits from his general practitioner to keep an eye on his condition. Tuesday afternoon they had a ritual, a pot of tea, 2 bottles of beer, and a drop of scotch. The doctor would check Jim's pulse, blood pressure, and prescribe him from time to time various medicines to assist his arthritis pain. Jim had a respect for the doctor, and he used to give him an annual Christmas gift of 300 quid. Angie and Jim were surprised one year when he asked Jim if he could double up the amount because he wanted to buy a color television. I was like, wow, what a nerve. So Jim had Angie make out a check for £600. Jim felt that he was the privileged one with an allowance from his son, and they recorded every little expenditure, even shoelaces and other small things. Every week, Angie drove Jim through to Liverpool to pay his betting account with his bookmarkers and cash. He always loved the horses and watched them on TV with great interest. He would spend a lot of time studying form. He only bet in a very small way, but he really loved it, and he learned all about the form of horses and their trainers. So that's why he was so happy when Paul bought him a racehorse, Drake's Drum, for his birthday. Jim, Angie said, had a great sense of humor and also a great sense of right and wrong. He was humble. When Paul found fame and bought Jim a house and promised to take care of him financially, it made Jim generous to a fault. He tried to overcompensate for his good fortune, and he had a frugal upbringing and tough times raising his 2 boys after Mary died, trying to be both a father and a mother to them. And she said, "Well done, Jim, well done." She said Paul took care of his dad financially to the end of his life. Now we come to what she had to say about John Lennon. To Angie, she thought that John wasn't the big, bold, acerbic guy that the world often saw. She knew he could be sarcastic and was a complex man with a brilliant mind. She thought he was a frightened little boy, and his fame had created an invisible wall around him. Jim was always a little suspicious of John, and even Paul, I think, was at times aware of the need to tread lightly in his presence. So great was their competitiveness. It was worse for John than for Paul losing their mothers. Paul had his father and his brother Mike, and John had his mother ripped away from him several times throughout his life. John was very patient with Ruth. She was a lively 5-year-old girl at that time, and he did silly things to make her laugh and made faces, and he read to her at night. Cynthia once told Angie that John respected her for getting on him for his manners. He once absent-mindedly handed her his empty cup and saucer, waggling it to indicate that he wanted another cup of tea, and she sternly told him, "We have a word in this house, please." She said she wasn't going to let anyone, not even him, misbehave in front of little Ruth, who was raised in a household where manners were a top priority. So Jim and Paul looked shocked when she said that to John, but he understood her motives. As the years went by, she said, they didn't see very much of John, and one time Paul took them to Kenwood, his house in St. George's Hill in Surrey. She remembered there was a suit of armor in the hallway and ornate pieces of furniture. It seemed like a mansion to her. And when John and Cynthia divorced, Angie saw more of Cynthia and Julian. Now she comes to talk about Aunt Mimi. When Angie met Aunt Mimi, she thought she was a stern lady. Angie said she compared her to Barker and Dobson's toffee, a bit of brittle on the outside, but a soft center. She always had John's welfare at heart, but really wanted him to be a lawyer or a doctor, anything but a rocker. She was extremely proud of his success, though. She would occasionally go to Rembrandt with Louise and Harry Harrison, and they would sit out in the back garden and have a leisurely afternoon tea. She didn't like mixing with people and was a private person, but Aunt Mimi did hit it off with Jim, and they would walk down to the garden and look at his rose garden, his vegetable patch, and his beloved grapevines. Angie thought that Aunt Mimi always seemed to be sad, and it may have been because she never had a child of her own. Now we come to Ringo Starr. Angie first met Ringo Starr when Paul took Jim, Ruth, and Angie and visited him and his wife Maureen at Sunny Heights, their lovely country home in St. George's Hill, a lush Surrey suburb. She remembered a tree house, a go-kart track on the grounds, and a beautiful dishwasher in the kitchen. Angie was trying to get Jim to let her have a dishwasher. Jim said the invention was stuff and nonsense, and that we'd always washed our dishes the old-fashioned way, by hand. Angie quietly told Ringo what Jim had said. When Ringo took them on a tour of the house, he did a pitch to Jim about the dishwasher. Angie was grateful for that. When they got back home, Jim said softly, "I suppose we should get one of those newfangled things." Until he saw Mo and Richie's dishwasher, he always assumed that dishes went round and round like a clothes washing machine. Angie got her wish, and she was glad to have it with all the entertaining she did through the years. It came in handy when Paul came home and invited lots of family, or Mike was in town and brought home many of his fellow performers and their various companions. So I'm going to end the video here. I really enjoyed this part of the book when Angie gave her thoughts about John, George, Ringo, and their families, and that was very interesting. And it was neat that Angie, Ruth, and Jim got to go to the Bahamas on a honeymoon and got to see the Beatles work on their film there. So I'm curious about what she has to say next. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help to pump up my channel. So I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.